to say your last name, so I'm going to just save myself. Thiago is from Chorus.ai, and I think one of the things we find fascinating about Chorus, we want to say a few things at this moment. That Chorus is conversation intelligence, so it's a company that has had the capacity to listen in on the AI engine can listen in on a lot of the sales calls of their customers. And so if you can imagine the amount of intelligence that Chorus has, they've been doing, during the early part of the pandemic, they were doing daily briefings to kind of keep us all up to date on, hey, what's working, what's not, what shouldn't you be saying, what should you be saying? And now it's moved to weekly briefings with their CEO. I know in the early stages of the pandemic, I was telling everybody, hey, you got to catch those briefings, assign somebody in your company to be listening to the Chorus briefings every day. And on top of that, Chorus is a partner of ours on a product space. And we want to thank them for providing the support to invite a lot of CROs, CSOs, and VPs of sales to this event so that we can have a substantive conversation. So, Thiago, I'm going to just leave it over to you and thank you for being here. And I know that you have a lot of data to share with us so that we can learn about what's going on out there with all those conversations.
Thanks, Howard. I appreciate it. And I've always just had one name ever since I moved to the US, 9 years old. I try to keep people from ever having to say my last name. So thank you for that. And Derek, really enjoyed the presentation. I want to give props to you and Zoom overall, one as a Chorus customer, but also to the point that I can't wait for one day to listen to how people have Chorus fatigue. So I'll say that we've really made it when we've reached that point. But anyway, so I'm the CRO of Chorus. I've been here for about 3 months. Prior to joining Chorus, I was the SVP of Global Sales and Customer Success at a company called Huddle, where I rolled out Chorus to the entire customer-facing team. So everything from pre-sales all the way to technical support. So I've joined a company that I'm extremely passionate about with a whole different level of conviction. And what I'm hoping to do today is talk through just the rise of C-suite participation across all our conversations that we're having with our customers and how you can better equip your team to show up to those meetings and have great success. So the agenda that I'll stick to is, first, I'll talk a little bit about the overall C-suite challenge. Then I'll dive into ways we are seeing our customers enable their teams to CXO-proof their deals so they're fully prepared for those meetings. And then lastly, I'll discuss some of the shifts in strategies that we have seen from the executive level push down on their teams in order for us to be more prepared for these type of engagements. But before I dive into the data, I was going to have Stephanie launch a poll across the board to ask all of you about who you're seeing in your deals.
And I apologize, Thiago. The poll, since I gave you host rights, will be down at the bottom. I didn't realize I wouldn't be able to access it from this end.
I think I just launched it.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll give everybody a little bit of time here. Seeing votes come in. So we're seeing quite a bit on the CEO and CFO front, which makes sense. So it seems like we don't have a lot of people selling to marketers or CTOs in the conference today. Got about 50% participation. I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. It's very interesting, as I mentioned. So it seems like lots of leadership without that many C-suite. But of those that are seeing a lot of C-suite get involved, we're seeing quite a few CEOs and CFOs, which makes sense. So let me continue on here. So now I'll dive into some of the data that we've uncovered to better label what this really entails. So what we found since the pandemic hit, and we've all had to change up our processes, it's that there's been about an 86% increase in C-suite executives actually jumping in and participating from the buying side. So this has obviously required lots of changes from how we approach our deals and how we prepare our teams. And this is something that we haven't seen too much of a dip over the last few months. And when you split this out across the various roles, I think the interesting piece is just how many more CEOs are getting involved across these conversations. But then when you look around the economic decision makers, the participation has been up by over 71% since Q1. This has obviously led to us have to think about how we change our message about the value that we add to our customers. And from analyzing millions of sales calls, what we're finding is C-level execs care about two things mainly, and that's savings and growth. So savings from the perspective of time and also money. And from a growth perspective, going even down to thinking about the day-to-day efficiencies that are gained across the entire workforce that translate to evergreen growth. And what I want to dive into now is how we can actually give you some tidbits on how you can help your team CXO-proof your deals so you're more prepared for those conversations. Before I jump in here, I had an overall question. Because of the shift that we are seeing, even on the approach of how we're attacking markets as revenue leaders, have you been intentional about arming your team to be successful with these high-level meetings? And here it goes. So I'm going to launch the poll now. And this is since the pandemic has hit. Have you focused on providing the right level of content, training to really shift how your sellers are thinking about the conversations they're going to have, and they can feel prepared for these new buyers? So I'm going to give it a couple more seconds here. So obviously, as expected, an overwhelming majority has adjusted their process, and we're going to have an exec briefing a little bit later. I'm looking forward to discussing this with everyone. Got about 40%. I'm going to pause here. And share the results. So as I mentioned, overwhelming majority has adjusted the sales process and getting everyone trained up, with a few stragglers out there still evaluating and figuring out if it's still necessary. So as mentioned, there's been an 86% increase in C-suite executives joining since around Q1. So some of the important things that we're seeing our customers arm their sellers with is really having a more standardized template of how they go about arming their champions with what they need to help prepare the C-levels that are joining from the buying side, but also more set ways of how they are preparing themselves for jumping on these conversations as sellers as they're thinking about how I can better align to the C-level execs on the call. The second is making sure that our teams are armed with financial literacy and understanding what are the levers that these C-level execs care about and how we can tie our ROI to that. Are there certain aspects, if you're in the enterprise space, do our reps actually know how to review 10Ks and figure out what the key priorities are for the business? And even so, what we've found is in SMB buyer side customers, there's a 3 times higher chance of a CEO actually joining that conversation. And it makes sense because as there's higher scrutiny in budgets, even if you own a budget and you typically were used to having the decision-making power to make that purchase, you're now having to go through new levels of approvals internally. And the way that you can get your team to be ROI detailed obsessed, as I like to call it, is you really need to focus on up-leveling the conversation from use case to business case. So with the use case perspective, you're typically focused on a particular workflow that may improve, a manager level on down type of outcome. So how can you focus on that business outcome tied to growth or time savings, for example, or money savings? That is the shift that we're seeing now. And the reason for that is that's how the C-suite is going to measure that impact. And then lastly, how can you make your software an essential service? And that's a hard question for us to always answer. And in our own internal discussions, the simple way that I like to have our teams think through this is to imagine, how could an outcome that we're providing within our solution make it into every single executive meeting that exists? So typically companies have their overall exec meeting every single week where the executives meet. How can some sort of outcome or data point from what you're providing make it into that meeting? That's, in a way, how you can ensure that you become an essential service or solution for your customer. And how can we arm our teams to be able to have these type of conversations? And the great part about this, and it's going to come to no surprise to any of you, is win rates go up with C-suite involvement. So one thing to think about is, how can we help our teams accelerate this process by getting access earlier? How can we guide our buyers to better understand how they can drive the conversation and highlight examples of other customers in their buying process to get these C-level executives involved earlier? And then what really matters is we do all this work to actually get the C-level folks there, but what do we do once they're in the conversation? So we found a direct correlation based on the level of engagement and talk time for the C-level people that join your call, and how that leads to the outcome of winning. And really the goal here is, how do you get them talking? And we found that on average, it makes sense to ask about 5 engaging questions to C-level folks that have joined the call to help your deal progress to the next stage and then eventually lead to a closed one. But it's important to remember that it's not just about the C-level folks talking. So at Chorus, based on analyzing millions of calls, we recommend about 40 to 60% of talk time should be done by the sales rep or the selling side. And that leaves right between 60 to 40% of the time for the customer base. And the average C-level talk time sits at, just say it hovers around 20%, which is really only 6 minutes of a 30-minute call. But what's important is to not only focus there, but on the other 20% to ensure that the rest of the buying side organization is also getting involved in providing feedback. And this goes back with us arming our champions to be prepared to mention things that are going to align with the priorities of the C-level individuals that are coming from the buying side. So now that we've dived into what we're seeing and some tidbits and recommendations on how we can better equip our teams, we wanted to just quickly share how we've seen some of our customers shift their strategies and how we've also personally shifted our strategies. We're going to do this focused on 3 key areas. The first is from the C-level perspective is we need to make sure that we're making ourselves available. The second is how do we take this and help accelerate our deals? And then lastly, either build or rebuild a more buyer-driven process. So in terms of being available, a lot of people here talked about Zoom fatigue. And I have a very different perception of Zoom fatigue. I don't see it as Zoom fatigue, especially because I was used to being on planes and out and about 50 to 60% of the year. And I don't get the same sort of fatigue from Zoom as I used to get from all the travel, especially international travel that I used to do. But what this has led to is that we are more accessible. And we should use this as a benefit to our teams. But it's important to also set some ground rules. So if you haven't already, determine what deals actually qualify a leader's time. To try to protect yourself from all these 30-minute meetings about each and every single deal where maybe you only need 10 minutes or so, is block off some office hours. People can just jump in and have these shorter conversations with you. And then lastly, if you haven't already, make sure you create a very set format for giving you the information that you need in order to support the deal that you're joining. Because the reality of it is if the buying side CROs are joining, we need to be looking out to match that. Second is accelerating deals. And something that we've found is don't think about this as only bringing in the executive that is tied to the revenue side from yourself on the selling side. Think about using your entire executive team. So if there's a big deal that you're in and a CFO is gonna join, think about bringing in your VP of finance or your CFO to also join in on the conversation and discuss things from their perspective on the value that your solution can bring. This is one thing that we've done internally, found a ton of success in terms of creating alignment in a very different perspective. And the second is payment terms. So really figuring out with the uncertainty that exists and cash flow issues that a lot of our customers are finding themselves in, really think about how flexible you can get across payment terms. And obviously a negotiation item, but we have seen an increase based on our data on net 60 and even net 90 payment terms. And then to also accelerate the deals, there have been changes in the buying process as well. And you've all probably on this call been involved in deals that have slipped because a new stakeholder jumped in, and maybe it was even something that someone felt like they owned the budget, but there's a new level of scrutiny that jumps in late in the game where they need to better understand the savings aspect and the growth aspect. So guide the prospect on what this new buying process could look like so they're better prepared to make sure that you're not running into those issues again. Then the last piece, and if this is something your company hasn't done over the past year, is think about either building or rebuilding a more buyer-driven sales process. So that the overall buy mechanism has changed, especially during the past 8 months or so. So really think about how can you look at this buyer's journey and then redefine what your sales process looks like. Where you got to go through defining the team that's going to be involved in this, rebuilding the customer journey map, think about the various customer outcomes that are tied to each one of those areas, then define how you can help guide your customers across these various stages. And then lastly, really figure out how do I best align my sales process to make this a success for our company, but also from the buyer side as well. So that's what I had to cover today. I think we have about 10 minutes or so for any Q&A that may have come up. I did not do a great job of checking out the chat, so I'll pause here.
I'm checking it for you, so I'm going to go ahead and ask, if we can, I'll have them ask their question. I think Rebecca Klein had a lot of comments and questions and thoughts. So Rebecca, I want you to, what's the top of mind question? You had a lot of comments. Are you there?
Yeah, so a lot of what you said absolutely resonated 100% with the things that we're seeing or trying to do. One thing that we struggle with, and I think that we saw in the chat that others experience this as well, is we've created decks that are outcome focused, that do focus on like ROI. How are we making their business more competitive, or saving them money, or what is, and sometimes getting to that value can be difficult. But even when we we're giving it to them, their knee-jerk reaction is to end up going back and talking product. So getting that mental shift and getting them confident in having those conversations is where I think we are today, and trying to really up-level that selling skill and that conversational, and I believe that the way that Lev put it was a Socratic, like getting it Socratic and getting them engaged. So making our sellers teachers. Can you comment on that a little bit in terms of engaging with the C-suite in that type of a method?
Yeah, so you bring up a great point, and my initial feedback, without knowing the selling motion that you're running, are you selling mainly to like enterprise level companies? Like what type of personas as well?
So our traditional model has been very high-end enterprise. We are trying to come down the stack and break in more into commercial. I wouldn't even say SMB. I would say like lower end enterprise. And that's a challenge because our products are expensive, but there's great value to be derived from it when they partner with us, because we're not like a point solution. So we absolutely are meeting with C-level.
Okay, makes sense.
In the bigger deals. It's breaking in isn't typically C-level.
Yeah. So I'm guessing like even with some of your enterprise, based on where your company has been, you're probably naturally getting access to that C-level. Maybe you have a name for yourselves, you have the right reference points, or are you still starting with some lower level folks and then building yourself up?
We, so I work for Hitachi Vantara. So you probably have heard of Hitachi, but not Hitachi Vantara. So there could be some name recognition, but it's not like saying Cisco or Salesforce or Microsoft, right? It's like Hitachi, what do you guys do? Wait, is it power drills or trains? Or wait, you're selling me hyper-converged infrastructure? Like, we have to totally position ourselves with that in that other space. They don't know who we are.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. How I've seen this been done successfully, and obviously I spend most of my time, about 30 to 40% of my day, speaking with other CROs from various companies, from enterprise all the way down to the SMB space. And what I constantly discuss with folks is how you can gain access to those individuals, those C-level, is sometimes through these, gatekeepers, right? Which we all know very, very well. So my recommendation overall is there's probably a particular type of way that you need to pitch some of the lower level folks on more of the use case based scenarios on how it's going to make their individual lives better, their personal workflows. Because the hope that I have is once you are getting to that C-level, they will be more focused on these business outcomes that you described. And what we spend a lot of time doing, even in our own sales processes, we start with sometimes with these use cases on some of these the end users, right, in the manager level, in particular. But throughout that, we are throwing in, like, think about what your boss is thinking about, or what your boss's boss is thinking about, are these areas. And we're slowly arming them for those conversations and to give us access to those individuals when we are able to win them over in our initial discussions. But that's it.
Yeah,
What we found to be successful.
So in the way that I'm hearing that, just to see if I'm clear, is essentially you're building a champion for yourself at that use case or that level, so that when you can get up a notch, is that a
Yep,
fair
and through,
assessment?
as we're building that champion, we're also helping broaden their perspective on the impact that this can have across their entire company, and how these individuals, right? And I don't like to ever I try to always say champions. Like, ideally, you don't want just one, right? You want to arm them as, hey, this is a way that you can also expand your impact that you're currently having. It's not just based on these key use cases that are going to make your life better and your potentially, even if you're the manager level, your team's life better. This is how it's going to improve your entire organization. And you can be the catalyst of that particular change.
Hey, Brian, I'm sorry, Thiago, I wanted to get in. Brian, are you available to ask your question? I thought it was a good one. Give some context around the data. Hey, Brian.
You actually answered that. The question was this approach of CXO engagement more weighted towards SMB versus enterprise? And you then came out and you talked about how it was much more likely to happen in the SMB. But I do wonder, are you guys seeing it in the conversations that you're monitoring? Are you seeing it happen even in the enterprise space more frequently now?
Absolutely. So that was just we're seeing 3x more likely on the SMB space, but this is happening across the board. And what's more interesting to me from the data that we're seeing, are even the involvement from CLevel in smaller purchases below even the 6-figure mark, which is quite a shocker, right? Because typically
and likely not sustainable, right? I mean, you would think.
That is the biggest question that exists. How long is this going to continue for? Another correlation too that exists is thinking through the type of service that's getting sold, right? If it's something that's in the land and expand type of model, and they know, hey, it might be starting small, but this could really grow, that would make more sense, right? To have that involvement, because it's going to be a bigger part of your stack in the future. But it's still just an interesting thing that we're seeing. And again, it's just a higher level of scrutiny. And this is why we all on this call need to make sure we're preparing our teams to be ready for these conversations, to elevate the conversations, knowing they're going to be a part of the buyer process. Howard, you're on mute.
Dave, you threw up a resource. Can you give us a little bit of context on that?
Threw up a resource.
Yeah, Dave Chatterton threw a resource into the chat.
Yeah, I did. So there was a question around, how you get to business value. And one of the things that some of our teams have used is the business canvas model. It's one that really kind of helps salespeople kind of get focused around what's important at the C-level and the CXO. And it's a great resource that's out there. I don't think a lot of people know about it, but you can, check the link out. It's great if you go through some of the strategy cells. I think that Chorus probably uses something very, very similar. I don't know a lot about what Chorus does, but I have an opinion that they probably use something like that, and then they can leverage it. But it's a great resource to be able to kind of frame your conversation and make sure that you're understanding and doing the right research before you're actually getting to a CXO conversation.
Very helpful.
Well, Thiago, we've got about a minute here. Do you want to give any final wrap-up thoughts? And obviously, you're doing a executive briefing a little bit later today with an invited list. So I'll let you wrap up, and then we'll go to break.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I hope you found this helpful based on the data that we found, and you can take this and drive some impact at all your organizations across the board. If any of you have any interest in learning more about Chorus, feel free to ping me directly, and I'll make sure that I align you with the right resource from our side. And I look forward to seeing many of you at the executive briefing a little bit later. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much today.